Will do.
And this is going to be recorded, so for those who are not going to be able to attend today's session with us, it will be posted on our YouTube channel. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know I sure did. I ate way too much, but it was great to be surrounded by family and friends. AFCEA thanks you for attending today's luncheon, but a special thank you to our luncheon sponsors, Definitive Logic, Deloitte, Segue Technologies, a Tetra Tech company, Array, Cloud Lake and Akamai Company, Macalogic, Insperity, and PE Systems. Without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to provide STEM scholarships and educational materials for our youth. So special thank you to those. AFCEA is having their holiday networking event presented by Segue Technologies on December 8th from 4:30 to 8 p.m. at the Dayton Art Institute. You will have an opportunity to get a private tour of the newest exhibit featuring Ralston Crawford's Air, Space, and War display. The emerging leaders are having a charity drive in conjunction and encourage you to bring a pack of diapers, size 4 and up, wipes, or a new pack of men or women underwear for the local women's shelter. In the spirit of giving, if you bring an item, you can receive an extra holiday cheer ticket. There will be no monthly luncheon in December, but we will pick back up in January. In November, our luncheons, we like to invite a veteran to continue to honor those who have served and continue to serve. Without our veterans and active duty, we industry folks wouldn't have an opportunity to help guide our boots on the ground to complete their mission. Now, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guest for today. AJ Orr, PMP, is an award-winning author, United States Army veteran, cancer survivor, internationally certified project manager, the founder and CEO of Simple Plan IT, and is passionate about helping to advance veteran-owned businesses in Ohio through his volunteer efforts with the national nonprofit Bunker Labs. He is a digital risk management expert with more than 15 years of experience in the ever-evolving field of cybersecurity. He is the expert companies rely on to provide sophisticated solutions to achieve business growth and maintain compliance. Through his work, he helps business leaders to create and implement a framework that allows them to future-proof their business. His company, Simple Plan IT, utilizes behavior-based security solutions to protect businesses from cyber attacks that target their people, control systems, robotics, IoT, and other smart devices that oftentimes go undetected. This will be an open forum structure, and we encourage you to raise your hand and ask questions at any point in today's talk. Over to you, AJ, to share all the updates on cybersecurity and CMMC 2.0.
Perfect, Joni. I appreciate it. Let me get my screen up here and we'll get started. All right, let me know if everybody's able to see my screen.
We can see it.
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so that was a whole lot that Joni threw out there. It's crazy to hear somebody else mention everything that you've done. But first, I would like to thank Joni and AFCEA for allowing me to come and share with all of you members and recording this for future people. My goal here today is to paint a clear picture of what's going on within the DoD cybersecurity landscape. My hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a good understanding of kind of what the situation is and have the pieces that you need in order to create a strategy for how you're going to move forward and proceed with everything. So there's a lot of confusion and misinformation out there in the market space that I'm going to try to cover and kind of clear up. Really kind of in a short amount of time. I know that we've got an hour here, but I'd like to leave a good bit of time at the end so that we can ask questions and so I can actually provide true value to what it is that you're coming here for. And so in order to do that, here we go, we'll switch the screens. All right. So in order to do that, I'm going to move pretty quickly through these 5 talking points. And once again, so we have plenty of time at the end to ask questions. And so with that said, if you have any questions as I'm going through it, or if I'm moving too fast, send a message in the chat or get Joni's attention so that she can slow me down and I'll stop and address those things at that point in time. And so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this thing. So, quick snapshot on me. Here's everything in written form that kind of Joni kind of went through in my bio. As an Army veteran, I'm not really big on talking about myself, so that's kind of the quick snapshot of who I am and what I've done. As she mentioned, I do a lot of work with I am an Army veteran, so I was a communication specialist in the Army, but I do a lot of work to help other veterans as well. Knowing that 22 of my brothers and sisters commit suicide every day, I was looking for a way that I could give back and kind of help them out. And so that's why I got involved with Bunker Labs, which is a national nonprofit that specializes in helping veteran and veteran spouses who want to be entrepreneurs. So essentially, they help them go from ideation to business launch, launch to growth, and then growth to scale. They've got programming in place to do all of that. And they've got 40 chapters currently all across the country, and they're headquartered in Chicago. So that takes that's a big focal point for me. But whenever I'm not doing that, then I'm the founder and CEO of Simple Plan IT, which is a digital risk management firm. And then there's some other nonprofit activities that I try to participate in as well. So, in order to clearly understand where we're currently at when it comes to the DoD and cybersecurity and the whole risk profile that they're trying to manage, we must first understand where we were and look at how we got here. So, back in the 2000s, the government realized that cyber attacks were on the rise and that the defense industrial base, which I refer to as the DIB, posed a possible threat to national security. So, to combat this, back in 2013, they introduced DFARS 7012. Now, 7012 basically provide contractors in the DIB with a framework for protecting sensitive data that they may have had in their possession as a result of their DoD contracts. Now, this was going to drastically, once it was rolled out, this was going to drastically improve the security posture of the DIB as a whole. From the DoD's perspective, this was a simple solution to their cybersecurity concerns, but they quickly realized that it wasn't going to be easy, that it wasn't going to be an easy task, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. So the DoD decided to give the DIB 4 years to make these necessary changes. So contractors simply need to do an assessment of their security posture as it currently is related to NIST SP 800-171. Now, mind you, at this point, the DoD didn't provide any guidance on how to do this, which ultimately led to a big problem because you had a lot of companies out there that were charging ridiculous fees just to come out and do these charges, or to do these assessments rather. And so this price gouging caused a lot of concern throughout the DIB as the fees, when they started to look at the feasibility of making this thing happen and making all these security changes. So that led to some of the problems that they had when they started to talk about costs, which led to a couple of different changes that we'll quickly get into. But once contractors identified all their gaps, all they needed to do was to create a POAM, or a plan of action and milestones, that outlined how and when they planned on having all 110 security controls that were outlined within NIST SP 800-171 implemented. They also needed to perform ongoing security log monitoring so in the event that they had a security incident, the DoD could help them to investigate and try to determine where the threat came from. So the DoD basically treated the POAMs like a statement of work and just expected the contractors to execute everything that they had laid out in their own individual POAMs moving forward. But as most of us know, there were two big problems with the DoD strategy that they didn't anticipate. And the first was it wasn't really fair for every contractor to meet all of the super high security requirements that they had laid out within this SP 800-171. I mean, think about it. If I was a landscaper that had a DoD contract because I took care of the grounds at one of their buildings, why in the world should I have to meet all these super high security regulations and controls whenever I don't have any of their sensitive information in my possession? So this was a valid question that a lot of contractors brought up in various stages whenever they said, hey, look, if I don't have sensitive information in my possession, why do I need to meet these super high security regulations and compliance, which make complete sense, and they were valid questions. The second big issue or big problem that they had with this was that the DoD expected everyone to execute the work that was outlined in their POAM that they submitted. Since nobody was actually coming back to check and verify things that had actually been done, many of the contractors just didn't do the work. So in fact, what the DoD found was that once they went out and started to do some random audits, they found that most of the DIB hadn't done any of the work on their programs, and they weren't even close to being compliant with all of the NIST SP 800-171. So ultimately, this gap here led to the emergency implementation of DFAR 7019 and 7020. So basically, the DoD realized that they had an issue in 2018. In 2019, they issued DFAR 7019 as a notice to say, hey, we're going to make the following changes here in the near future. We're going to need everyone to do another security assessment to identify the gaps that exist between where they're at and the 110 security controls that are outlined within SP 800-171. Once you've completed that assessment, we're going to have you submit it to us. So stay tuned for more information to come. So that's basically what I paraphrased there, but that's basically what DFAR 7019 said. Then they came out with DFAR 7020, which went into effect last November. So 7020 said that as a contractor, we need you to do this specific assessment and it'll generate a score. We want you to then send that score to us along with a POAM that outlines how and when you're going to take your score from where it currently is all the way up to 110, which is passing, and that's checking off the box for all 110 security controls that are outlined within NIST. Now, before we go any further, let's do a quick recap so everyone's clear on where things stand up until this point. So the DoD determines that foreign governments are able to steal intellectual property through the way of the DIB. One way for an attacker to compromise a network one way for them to do that was for an attacker to compromise a network that gives them access to another network of higher level. So I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the Target attack back in 2013. That's essentially what happened. So an HVAC contractor got compromised, and the attacker was able to use that back-end access into Target in order to implement the breach. So that's one way that the DIB posed a vulnerability or posed a threat to the DoD. The other was through the access of CUI. And so what an attacker would do was, or what they were afraid of, is that if an attacker was able to compromise enough pieces of CUI from enough different vendors that all pertain to one specific project, well, if they were able to put all that information together, then that would actually give them access to classified information. And so that was the other big threat that the DoD was looking to curtail with all of these solutions. So to protect against this threat, in 2013, the DoD rolls out DFAR 7012, which gives contractors the list of 110 security controls that will all but ensure the protection of this data. Now, everyone has until December 31st, 2017 to comply with all these security controls. So the contractors basically have 4 years to put all this in place. But NIST SP 800-171 wasn't fair, and it wasn't fair to all the different contractors because if they didn't have sensitive information, they shouldn't have to meet all the requirements. But I think what was more impactful was that the DoD wasn't verifying that contractors were actually implementing these security controls. So when they started to go out and do the security audits, they found that the vast majority of the DIB wasn't even close to satisfying the security requirements laid out in this SP 800-171. So in a two-step process to fix this, they first rolled out DFAR 7019 and 20. Now, these two rules were basically a way for the DoD to assess the overall security posture of the DIB. You see, by forcing everyone to take a standardized assessment and submit those scores into the supplier performance risk system, which I refer to as SPRS, they're able to see where the weak points are within the DIB as a whole. So in essence, DFAR 7019 and 7020 were basically designed to provide the DoD with a baseline for what the security posture of the DIB as a whole currently looks like. So that ultimately puts them in a position to where they can segue into CMMC. So DFAR 7021 is where CMMC 1.0 was introduced. Now, CMMC 1.0 was designed to address the two big problems that we discussed when it came to the rollout of DFAR 7012. So in order to address the unfairness of the smaller contractors not needing to meet all these security requirements, CMMC actually broke up all the security requirements into tiers ranging from level 1 to level 5. This way, contractors that didn't have access to sensitive information didn't have to try and satisfy all these security controls that were outlined within NIST SP 800-171. It also provided them with a verification system. So rather than the DoD taking everyone's word that they were actually doing everything and implementing all the security controls, which they had already tried and failed at, every contractor now would have to go through an audit in order to verify that they were meeting the necessary security requirements. However, CMMC 1.0 was the problem one of the big problems that they had with CMMC 1.0 was that it was really set to be black and white. Either you met all the security requirements that the level that you were trying to meet had in place, or you didn't. There wasn't any gray area in there. There was no room for POAMs. And so when it came time for you to do your scheduled audit, you better make sure that you were checking all those boxes that the auditor was going to be reviewing. Otherwise, you'd have to reschedule, go through remediation, and possibly incur additional costs, which was a big concern. So CMMC 1.0 was scheduled to be fully implemented by 2025. But before that could happen, they encountered three major issues. The first was with an issue with cost. They quickly started to see that there was going to be a huge cost to roll this thing out. I mean, who was going to pay for everyone to get audited? How were small contractors going to be able to afford implementing some of these security controls? I mean, there were a lot of questions that were built up around cost. Now, these were the things that need to be addressed. And, one of the things that the DoD started to look at once they started to implement the CMMC accreditation body and working with them, trying to figure out how they were going to address the cost factor. The second issue that they had was a lack of participation. There's roughly 250 to 300,000 contractors that make up the DIB across the country. That means it was going to take a massive amount of certified third-party assessors, or C3PAOs as they were being called, to be able to go out to every contractor and get them audited by 2025. Unfortunately, the CMMC accreditation body couldn't get their programming together fast enough, nor could they convince enough people to pay the money to actually become assessors. I mean, just to put it in perspective, as of right now, the CMMC Accreditation Board has less than 10 authorized C3PAOs that are actually in place. So once again, there was no way that they were going to get this rollout hit by 2025 just because they didn't have enough participation. And finally, the last thing, or one of the other big issues that they had was the potential of losing contractors. There were a lot of contractors, and maybe even some of you that are on this call, that started asking themselves if these contracts were worth the hassle and the additional cost. I mean, my organization and I, we spoke with countless contractors that were contemplating no longer pursuing government contracts just because they didn't want to deal with the hassle, and more importantly, because the added cost was going to eat too far into their already thin margins. And with the supply chain and the DIB already under stress, the DoD realized and knew that they couldn't afford to lose any percentage of their contractors. Otherwise, that would throw all of their projects off whack and put them way behind. So these three things, along with a number of other factors that played into this, it ultimately led to the failure of CMMC 1.0 and ultimately the announcement of CMMC 2.0 back on November 9th. So CMMC 2.0 brings with it a few significant and noteworthy changes. The first is that certification levels went from 5 levels down to 3 levels, which ultimately, to me, made complete sense, in my opinion, especially whenever you factor in that the DoD never had any intentions of issuing contracts with CMMC level 2 or level 4 requirements. I mean, if the DoD never had any plans of using them, I don't know. It makes zero sense to me why the CMMC accreditation body even wasted the time in getting them put in place and formulating them. But I can go on about my issues with the CMMC accreditation body. The second is that the DoD removed all the CMMC security specific security controls. If you look over on the left-hand side of the chart, and I apologize, I should have made this bigger. But on the left-hand side of the chart, level 5 had 171 security controls. Level 4 had 156 security controls, and level 3 had 130 security controls. NIST SP 800-171 only has 110 security controls. And so they're standardizing on the NIST framework moving forward. And so according to the DoD, if there's any security controls that they think need to be added to the framework, then the DoD is going to work directly with NIST in order to get them to add it to their framework rather than adding things on top of it specific to CMMC or to the DIB. The third thing that they did was that the DoD was going to once again allow POAMs to be submitted in certain circumstances. But here's the catch to that. For starters, one, they haven't clearly identified which of the 110 security controls would qualify to be placed on a POAM. But more importantly, if a POAM is created, it must be closed within 180 days. So while they're doing away with the strict pass or fail nature of CMMC 1.0, they're only giving you 3 months to resolve your issues and be 100% compliant with all the NIST SP 800-171 security controls, or they say you'll be subject to contractual remedies. So whatever's laid out in the contract terms and everything else like that. And then finally, they're doing away with the requirement for everyone to go through a third-party audit. As it stands right now, or at least what they've put out, level 3 and some level 2 contracts will require a third-party audit. Now, we're being told that the level 3 audits will be performed by DIBCAC, which is for some of you out there, which is short for Defense Industrial Based Cybersecurity Assessment Center. But they're also saying that some C3PAOs may be allowed to perform level 2 audits. They haven't clarified that yet as far as what that's going to look like. But so what that means is that some contractors out there will be, for those that are level 1 and a portion of you guys that'll be a level 2, you guys will be able to self-attest that you're meeting the appropriate security requirements. Now, like I said, at this point, the DoD hasn't worked out exactly how all of this is going to look out, or how it's all going to look, or how they're going to differentiate which level 2 contractors will be required to do an audit and which ones will be able to self-attest. Now, with that said, the DOJ is adding some teeth to this thing for those of you that are going to self-attest. Because remember, the issue they had with DFAR 7012, with the DFAR 7012 rollout, which is one of the things that led to all of this to begin with, was that the contractors that were self-attesting that they were doing things, they actually didn't put the work in, they actually didn't do it. So this time around, if it's determined that you knowingly submit an inaccurate self-attestation, you'll be subject to the damage and statutory penalties that are outlined underneath the False Claims Act. But here's another twist to this one. Here's another twist to this thing though. They've also included a clause for whistleblowers. So now a whistleblower can bring suit on behalf of the government underneath the False Claims Act and share in the recovery. So that means that if there's contractors out there that decide to do some shady stuff or cut some corners in order to reduce cost, I tell them all, be careful with what you're doing, because if an employee finds out, they can get compensated just for reporting you. So I know I just threw a lot out there, so I want to pause right here to see if there are any questions, comments, or concerns about those changes that just came out with CMMC 2.0. I see no hands. Robert.
Yeah, quick question. So this doesn't in any way affect normal ATO authorization processes for government contracts, even if you're a vendor on a government funded program delivering something to the government. You're not required to follow CMMC, right? Just standard RMF.
Correct. And as it stands right now, CMMC, and I'll touch on this here in a minute. Basically, CMMC right now is in limbo because it's not enforced yet.
Yeah. So no change for the last 4 years.
That is my ultimate frustration with all of this, and the sense I think across the board is that, for the past 4 years, 4 years plus, they've had people jumping through hoops trying to get all their ducks in a row, figure out how they're going to do this thing, and then they pull the rug out from underneath us and say, you know what, we were just joking. We're gonna do something different. So all that work that you put in, it might be good, but if you're working to get certified and everything else like that, put that on hold, because that's not going to happen.
Exactly.
So those are the major changes that were released a few weeks ago when it came to CMMC 2.0, which now brings us to, once again, where do things stand now? And so, as I was just saying, CMMC right now, it's sort of in limbo. The DoD has stated that CMMC 1.0 right now has been put on hold, and any further efforts to seek certification are completely voluntary. So you don't have to do it, but if you're doing it and you want to do it, great. There's talks that they might be trying to come up with some incentive programs for those that do get their CMMC certification. Prior to everything else. But once again, it makes me scratch my head of how are you going to incentivize something whenever you don't even have the requirements laid out to what it is that actually they're meeting. If you're getting rid of all the requirements, so basically, I guess they're going to try to incentivize everybody to be compliant with the 110 security controls within NIST SP 800-171 and 172. But most contractors are going to fall underneath the 171 line. So I guess they're going to try to incentivize that, but in all reality, that's already been covered within DFAR 7012, which once again just makes me scratch my head as far as what they're doing. CMMC 2.0 has to go through the defining process, so they have to start clearly defining exactly what all these things are going to be. How are they going to bifurcate the level 2 requirements for those who can self-attest and for those who have to go through an audit process? And then once they kind of clearly define everything, then it has to go through the rulemaking process, which the DoD is estimating that can take anywhere from 9 to 24 months. So what that means is that right now, DFAR 7012, 7020, and NIST SP 800-171 continue to be the law of the land. And period. I mean, that's pretty much it. And then finally, the DoD has effectively kicked the can down the road when it comes to contractors achieving CMMC certification. And like I said, with the rulemaking process estimated to take anywhere from 9 to 24 months, I mean, realistically, it could be November of 2023 before we even have any idea what CMMC 2.0 is going to officially look like. So for all of you out there, if you have people that are coming to you saying, hey, you still need to get CMMC certified, you need to do this now and we can help you, you might want to walk away from those guys, because as it stands right now, that's not the case and that's not true. Once again, the DoD has effectively put this on hold and said, hey, until CMMC 2.0 has gone through rulemaking, there's nothing that they can hold you accountable for, which, like I said, ultimately pushes everything back to DFAR 7012 and 7020 and NIST SP 800-171. So here's what every contractor, oh, I see a hand. Johnny, sorry.
Yes, AJ. So how does that work if it's in a proposal that CMMC level 4 or 5 are recommended, or that they're forcing that issue in an RFP?
So that I would go back to the issue of the RFP and get clarification on that language. So what had previously happened is that in preparation for CMMC, the CMMC rollout, if we look back at DFAR 7021, essentially what the DoD said was that, hey, all contractors and all primes, you need to start putting this language in your contract, because they were basically pushing the orders down and said, hey, put it in your contracts to all your subcontractors to make sure that they're meeting all these requirements. And so those things just got arbitrarily thrown in there, because realistically, the CMMC accreditation body didn't even have level 4 or level 5 clearly defined. So even if they had, like I said, they've got, I think last I checked, they've got 5 or 6 auditors that are C3PAOs that are listed that could actually go out and do the audits. But even if they went out to go do the audits, they couldn't audit you against a level 4 or level 5, because those terms and definitions had to be clearly defined. And that's one of the other reasons why they switched to 2.0, or why they decided to make a pivot, was because this thing was just taking too long. Level 5. I don't even think they even started to identify or define what level 5 was going to look like. And so all the language that's in contracts right now, it was just boilerplate. They were just cutting and pasting things in there so that they were being compliant with DFAR 7021. But really, there's no way to hold anybody accountable to those things as it currently stands. Robert?
Yeah, just kind of tailing on to that question. Are there still requirements for 3PAOs? I mean, is that still going to be intentionally a thing? Are they wanting to have still third-party assessors, or is it just going to be self-attestation going forward and
So
proof,
it,
with
it
proof, obviously?
it depends on who you ask. So if you ask the people in the CMMC accreditation body, they're going to tell you yes. And I was in a meeting with them last week or the week before rather, where they were saying, hey, you know, as an RPO and, you know, those that are going through the track to become certified assessors, they're saying, hey, yeah, there's still value here. But as somebody that's on that track, I fail to see where the value is going to be. And it's really going to come down to if the DoD, because when the DoD rolled out and made their announcement of CMMC 2.0, they said on the announcement call that DIBCAC was going to be responsible for doing all of the audits, and that included the level 2 audits, definitely the level 3s, and they said the level 2 audits were also going to be performed by DIBCAC. The challenge that I think that they're going to have with that is, once again, you don't have the manpower to do that. And at the same time, you don't even know where you're going to where that's going to be bifurcated as far as who's going to do the audits and who's not. And so I think when it's all said and done, I think there's going to be some C3PAOs that are going to be needed for those level 2s. But according to the DoD, unless they decide to change it as they're going through this defining process, DIBCAC is going to do all the level 3 audits, and then they say they're going to do the level 2s, but I just don't think they have the manpower to actually do all the level 2s. So I think there's going to be a need for some C3PAOs, but far less than what was going to be needed for everybody to be audited.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Absolutely. So where we stand now, here's what every contractor should be doing right now, in my opinion. So the first things first, make sure that you're compliant with DFAR 7020. Do your self-assessment, submit your scores, create your POAM, and establish an incident response plan. Because if you were to suffer a security incident, you're still beholden to DFAR 7012, and you've got 72 hours to be able to report that to the DoD. So that they can help in doing their investigation to determine, you know, was it a nominal threat, or was it actually a threat or an attack that came from a foreign entity and things of that nature. The second thing that I suggest, or that we recommend that you do, is to complete a business assessment. Now, I know that business assessment can mean different things to different people, and so let me explain what I mean here. So pursuing government contracts should actually be a business decision. You should evaluate what percentage of your business revenue comes from government contracts, as well as what percentage comes from private contracts. And if you evaluate it from this perspective, then it's gonna give you two things. And the first thing it's going to tell you is, or at least help you to do, is it's going to help you to guide your security strategy. And so let's do this. So let's say that government contracts represent 65% or more of your business revenue, and that the CUI flows through or touches 65% or more of your operations. If you fall into that type of category, then my suggestion to you would be to say you need to start looking at what it's going to take to get your entire business completely compliant with the 110 security controls that are outlined within NIST SP 800-171. But let's say that government contracts still make up 65% or more of your revenue, but rather than the data touching 65% or more of your operations, let's say that it only touches 35% or less. Well, now it may make more sense for you to create an enclave or a separate network that only processes government contract stuff. So this could be a way that you could actually reduce your security costs, since you'll have a much smaller environment and subset of your people that you have to worry about making fit and comply with the super high security regulations that are outlined within NIST. The other thing that you could determine after doing your business assessment is that maybe DoD contracts are a small portion of your revenue, and it doesn't make sense for you guys to continue pursuing those contracts. Because, and I've had these conversations with other contractors out there where they've said, hey, you know what, these contracts make up a small percentage of our overall revenue. It's not worth the headache or the hassle for me to jump through all these hoops to meet these security requirements. And they're deciding to move on, which is, once again, pursuing government contracts should be a business decision. And so if it makes sense for your business because of the revenue and the opportunity, then, what you have to look at now is, how are you going to meet all those security requirements? But as it stands right now, you have time to examine your options and make an informed decision. If you want to continue to do those contracts, like I said, figure out a way or what it's going to take for you to address the 110 security controls. Whether that's implementing, the security controls across your entire organization, whether that's deploying an enclave, whether that's on premise or in the cloud, whatever it is, you need to weigh your options so that you can actually get the ball rolling and start moving in those directions. Because based on what the DoD is saying, NIST SP 800-171, it's not going anywhere. And in fact, it's going to be the de facto standard moving forward. And that's what they're going to lean on. And so that's from a technical standpoint. That's it. That's where we stand. That's where we sit. And I'll throw out there, if you guys have any questions or need help with things such as SOC services, enclave deployments, policy development, or even putting together documentation. That's what our team is designed to do. We're one of the few registered RPOs out there in the U.S., and we've got a U.S.-based security operations center that's designed to simplify security and compliance for businesses. And so with that, I will open it up for more questions and more detailed conversation.
Anyone have any questions for AJ? The floor is open.
Comment, a good presentation. You distilled it down really well, so I appreciate that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think once people can understand kind of the process, or at least kind of the lay of the land, then I think it starts to make a little bit more sense. Because if you just look at them from regulatory numbers and requirements, then the water gets pretty muddy. But if we take a step back and we actually look at, okay, what is the DoD really trying to accomplish? And really what they're trying to accomplish is to protect national security. We've got foreign entities and governments that are looking at any ways that they can steal our intellectual property. I mean, we've lost intellectual property for fighter jets over the years, amongst many of other things. And so the DoD is just looking at, how do we protect this information? And they realize that, if you look at it from a criminal's perspective, I'm going to attack the weakest link. And chances are smaller contractors that are doing, that are playing one small part to the whole, chances are they don't have the super high security stuff in place, and they're easier targets. And so if I can hit a bunch of easy targets, grab that information, and then I can start to pull all that information together and piece it together, then I've got a good picture of what the overall or the big classified project is. And so that's kind of been their attack method over the years. And so kudos to the DoD for recognizing that's a threat vector, and trying to fix it. The challenge is that they've really fumbled the ball when it came to this rollout. And as we discussed earlier, Robert, the past 4+ years have just been flushed down the toilet now, because we're basically starting back over from scratch, or going back to DFAR 7012, which is still kind of the reigning rule.
Well, that's the question. The confusion really is what as a vendor, right? As a contractor for my own internal networks and internal, my DevOps infrastructure and whatnot. What am I actually required to do right now, right? So I'm, because I'm an ISSM for several government programs, so that's easy, right? I know the ATO process, whether it's fast track, continuous, whatever, right? We know what to do on that side. But for the vendors, they're coming to me and saying, well, what do I need to be compliant with? And I'm like, well, I kind of think probably maybe sort of you're supposed to be doing CMMC, but definitely 171. So,
And I would go back to that. So right now, kind of put the CMMC terminology on hold,
Mhm.
Because CMMC, for all intents and purposes, right now doesn't exist and never really did because it was never really fully rolled out. And so really what they need to look at being compliant with is uh, NIST SB 800-171.
Exactly. And that's what I tell them. I was like, just do that. If you do that, you're fine.
And that's it. And that's going to, like I said, the DoD is leaning back and making that the de facto standard. And when they said, hey, if we want to add something to it, or we determine security controls need to be added, then we're going to work directly with NIST to get them added to the framework. That just lets me that it's not going anywhere, and that's what they're going to standardize on and stick with.
Agree.
Now, I would say the one good thing that they've done recently, I like the idea of what they've done with 70/20 in making everybody go through a standardized assessment. It's so this way that they know exactly what everybody's dealing with and everybody can be benchmarked according to the same standards. And so having everybody submit their scores gives them a true baseline on where everything sits and exists. The challenge then becomes, what is it going to take for these contractors to get compliant with all 110 of those security controls? And does it make sense to do it across the entire organization, or does it make sense to create a smaller separate network where that's where all of your government contract stuff runs? And that's a more cost-effective way of approaching this thing. So rather than to do the entire organization as a whole, break it out as a subset and run it independently and do it in an enclave, whether that's an on-premise separate network or whether that's a cloud solution. But to me, that makes the most sense in a lot of these situations, depending upon the size and scale of the organization, um, when it comes to how we're going to address these things. I'd say the other challenge that the DoD has right now that I'm interested to see how they're going to do it, if they're going to do a better job of it, is that the DoD has done a crappy job of identifying what is CUI and designating it appropriately. Because I've seen some contracts where it's like it's labeled as CUI, and I'm like, why is this CUI? It didn't make any sense. And so, uh, and at the same time, there were other contracts where I saw I was like, maybe that should be considered CUI that wasn't labeled as such. And so the challenge that I think the DoD has is that whenever they're creating these RFPs and contracts, is that they're not doing a good enough job as far as designating and identifying what CUI is. So because since there's no standards, it's all across the board, and that makes it even challenging for a contractor to say, okay, well, do I process CUI?
Right. That's where the SCG should come in. The security classification guide should define that for the whole program. But in my experience, those are so vague
Yes.
that the contractor, the vendors coming to me and saying, hey, how do I handle this stuff? Well, I'm like, well, it's in the SCG. And they're like, well, the SCG just defines, and I'm like, well, the SCG is a guide. It's not implementation instructions. So it tells you what you should do, not how to do it. So then you have to help them define, okay, well, what are my implementation steps to make sure I handle this CUI appropriately, right? So it can cause some confusion, and you're right, it does cause confusion in proper labeling, because we have the same problem in reverse where folks are like, well, this be classified or CUI, because I don't feel like it rises to the level of classification. So again, it in some cases it's subjective, but it shouldn't be. It should be very clearly defined, but it's not. So you run into problems constantly.
Completely agree. One of the things that they did with CMMC 2.0 that I didn't mention is with CMMC 1.0, federal contract information was considered to be protected, needed to be protected. They've now determined that that's no longer the case, and so that does free up some of the burden there as well.
Is that a good idea though?
Uh, if you
Again,
ask me,
subjective again. Subjective, right?
right. I mean, I say no. I mean, just for the simple fact of, it's kind of one of those things that just puts a target on you. Like, if it's known that I have federal contracts, well, now, if I'm a criminal or if I'm a foreign entity that's trying to access that data, I don't care what information, whether it's, if you say that you have federal contract information, now you become a target. And I'm just trying to see what you have access to that I could possibly use and monetize it somewhere down the line.
Yeah, and then if you're not protecting that information and that part of your enclave, are you opening up and exposing yourself potentially to a threat actor to use that as a vector to get into your other network, right?
Correct. Which once again is a vulnerability point. And so I think what the intentions that the DoD had with 7012, I think they're good. I mean, I think from as a security guy, and really, I look at cybersecurity as a digital risk management. Because really what we're doing, you need to be able to manage your digital risk. And I think every business should be in the process of doing digital risk management. So not looking at cybersecurity as an IT function of your business, but look at it as a digital risk management function of your business, because criminals aren't after your computers, your networks, or your hardware. They're after your digital assets, your financials, your intellectual property, your client data, your employee data. It just happens to exist in a digital format. And so as a business leader, you need to understand where your sensitive information exists, where it exists on the network, who has access to it, and do you have a way to identify if somebody accesses it that shouldn't have access to it? I mean, in a nutshell, that's what NIST does. It does it through 110 ridiculously stringent security controls, and a lot of it is really documentation, and that's the biggest pain point when it comes to when you look at NIST SP 800-171. A lot of it's the documentation of the processes and everything else like that. That's the painful piece. The technology pieces that go in place to make this stuff happen really isn't that complicated. It's just making sure that you've got good policies, procedures, and workflows, and they're documented so that if an auditor comes in or if something happens, that you can clearly lay out, this is what happens, this is how we do it, and this is where the gap existed, or this is how our system was compromised. But as long as you've got that, I mean, that's what they're looking for, is do you have good policies in place? Do you have good processes in place? Is everything documented? And if it is, then you've done your due diligence, you've done everything you can to protect this data, so therefore we're not going to hold you accountable for it.
Agree, 100%.
But I think those are things that every business should be doing, in my personal opinion.
Should be, yeah, should be.
At least on some level. To have the fact that we've got a CMMC level 1 with 17 security controls, to me just makes me scratch my head, because the 17 security controls, which are still going to carry over into 2.0, they don't have any plans on changing that. But they're so basic. It's like, they're pushing you to do, hey, you should be doing this as a bare minimum, and this is what stuff that every business should be doing. But the controls that are listed in those 17 controls are really, really basic.
Well, if you define the minimum, that's what most people will do, right?
Challenge. And that's the challenge. And they're trying to, I get what the DoD is trying to do right now. They're trying to skirt that line and say, okay, we know that this is going to be intensive for a lot of people. But, in my opinion, doing work with the government shouldn't be easy. We have access to sensitive information that our national enemies and counterparts want to have access to. So doing business with the government shouldn't be easy. You should have to jump through some hoops. I mean, it's hard enough going through the RFP process and everything else like that. And it's like that way for a reason, because they just don't want anybody coming off the street and getting these contracts and doing work and creating an exposure point. And so I think, once again, government contracting and taking that on should be a business decision. The financial upside is there, absolutely. But with that, there are certain business challenges that you're going to have to now undertake, and security has to be one of them.
Any additional comments or questions?
Yeah, because I think Robert and I can talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah, I do want to before you drop off, I'm going to sync up with you later, because I'm curious about this organization you're a member of.
Bunker Labs.
Yeah, Bunker Labs, that's the one. Yeah, so I'll sync up with you after.
Perfect. If anybody wants, like I said, my contact information is up there on the screen. I know that Joni had mentioned the book. If you go to ajor.com, you'll find more information on the book if anybody's interested. The book is basically a provides non-technical people with a framework for how they can future-proof their business. So addressing technology, how to stay ahead of the curve, and then addressing cybersecurity as well. And with that, I will stop sharing and give it back to you, Joni.
All right. Well, thank you again to our distinguished guest, AJ Orr, for ending our 2021 Luncheon series. We're very honored to have had you speak today and share on cybersecurity and CMMC 2.0. As a reminder, previous luncheons and other events are recorded and on our YouTube channel. If you go out to our website under events and scroll to the bottom, you'll find the link to our channel. From all of our volunteers, executive board, past speakers, and industry partners, we wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. See you all on December 8th, and if not, we shall see you in 2022. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, AJ.